My name is Rosalie Tran. I am 39 years old. And the morning I understood what my mother-in-law had been doing to my marriage for 7 years, I was standing in a pediatrician's waiting room in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, holding my 4-year-old daughter's hand and reading a text message on my phone that had been sent to the wrong person. The text was meant for my husband. It was from his mother. And it said, in the specific language of a woman who has never once considered that she might be wrong about anything, she's still doing it. The crying, the neediness. Davis deserves better, and you know it. Come home this weekend. We'll talk. My daughter was pulling at the hem of my shirt because there was a fish tank in the corner of the waiting room, and she wanted to show me something in it. A blue fish, she said. Mama. Look at the blue fish. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the text. I looked at my daughter again. She was 4 years old, and she had my nose and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had been running a low fever since Tuesday. And all I had been doing for the previous 48 hours was taking her temperature and making her soup and sleeping in the rocking chair beside her bed because she slept better when she could hear me breathing. The crying, the neediness. 7 years of my marriage suddenly rearranged itself in my mind, the way a room rearranges when someone finally turns the lights on. Not new furniture. The same furniture. Just visible now in the way it had always been arranged, in the way it had always been pointing at me. My name is Rosalie Tran. Before I was Rosalie Tran Whitfield, I was Rosalie Tran, the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had come to Louisiana in 1982 with $200 and a belief in work that I have never seen equaled in any other human being I have met in my 39 years on this earth. My mother, Lynn, ran a nail salon on Magazine Street in New Orleans for 23 years. My father, Huy, worked in restaurant kitchens until he had saved enough to open his own, a small Vietnamese place in Métairie that became, over 15 years, the kind of restaurant that people drove an hour for and felt lucky to get a table. They were not expressive people in the way that American families are sometimes expressive. They did not say I love you at every departure and arrival. They did not discuss feelings at the dinner table. They showed up. That was their language. They showed up for everything, every time, without announcement, and the showing up was the whole sentence. My mother showed up to every school event I ever had, including the ones I had not told her about, because she had a calendar she kept in the nail salon where she wrote down everything I mentioned in passing and checked it twice a week. My father showed up at my college graduation in a suit he had bought specifically for the occasion, a dark navy suit that he had pressed himself the night before, and that was slightly too large in the shoulders, in the way of a man who had spent 20 years lifting and carrying, and whose body had changed around the suit he had bought for the future version of himself he was working toward. They showed up. That was their whole language. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, I understand now, the most precise and complete form of love I have ever been given. I tell you this because the story I am about to tell you is about a different kind of family. A family that said all the right words in all the right rooms and arranged itself beautifully for every occasion, and that had been, for 7 years, quietly and systematically dismantling the thing I had built with their son, not with cruelty, with something that required me 7 years and a wrong text message to finally name. Before I take you all the way back to the beginning, please like this video, and subscribe to Silent Will Stories. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I need to know who is here tonight, because this story is the one I have been the most afraid to tell, and I need to know it is landing somewhere real. Now let me take you back. Not to the pediatrician's office, to a Sunday afternoon in October, 8 years ago, to a dinner table in a house in Baton Rouge that smelled like roasted chicken and white wine, and the particular warmth of a family that has been performing itself for so long that the performance has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. The Whitfield family home was the kind of house that photographed beautifully. I say this not as a criticism. I say it as an observation that took me 7 years to fully understand the implications of. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street in the Garden District adjacent neighborhood of Baton Rouge, where the houses were old enough to have histories and well-maintained enough to suggest those histories had been comfortable ones. The magnolia in the front yard had been there since 1962. The shutters were painted a specific shade of green that Patricia Whitfield, my mother-in-law, described as historic sage, and that matched, not coincidentally, the color on the front door of the house 2 doors down that had been featured in a regional homes magazine in 2009. The kitchen had marble countertops and a 6-burner stove and copper pots that hung from a rack above the island in a way that suggested serious cooking happened there. Serious cooking did happen there. Patricia was a genuinely accomplished cook, and the Sunday dinners she produced were among the finest I had eaten outside of my father's restaurant. I want to give her that, because giving the people in our stories only their failures is not honesty. Patricia Whitfield was talented, organized, socially skilled, and capable of producing a roasted chicken that made grown men emotional. She was also the most effective architect of a narrative I have ever encountered in my personal life, and the narrative she had been constructing, carefully and incrementally, for the 7 years of my marriage to her son Davis, was a narrative in which I was the problem. Not overtly. Never overtly. Patricia Whitfield did not do anything overtly. She did things in the specific register of a woman who has learned that the most durable damage is the kind that leaves no visible mark. She operated in suggestion and implication and the particular weaponization of concern. She framed everything as worry. She was always worried. Worried about Davis's stress levels. Worried about whether the house in Baton Rouge we had bought together was too much for us to manage. Worried about whether Rosalie was happy, because she seemed, and here the word she chose was always careful and specific, she seemed fragile. Fragile. I was not fragile. I was a pediatric occupational therapist with a caseload of 32 children, a mortgage I managed, a garden I kept, a household I ran, and a 4-year-old I was raising with the specific full-bodied commitment of a woman who had watched her own parents show up for everything and had decided that showing up was the whole language. I was not fragile, but Patricia had been saying it in various forms to various people in various rooms for 7 years. And the thing about a word said consistently in enough rooms to enough people is that it eventually finds its way into the air of the place where you live, and you start breathing it without knowing it. I had started to believe it. That is the part that is hardest to say out loud. By year 5 of my marriage, I had started to believe, in the specific quiet way that beliefs settle into you when they arrive in the voice of someone who sounds like they care about you, that I was perhaps more difficult than I should be, more sensitive, more requiring, that my need for direct communication and honest conversation was a demand rather than a reasonable expectation, that my discomfort at being consistently talked over at Sunday dinners was a personal failing rather than a fair response to being consistently talked over. I had started to manage myself, to make myself smaller in the rooms where the Whitfields gathered, to speak less and agree more, and carry whatever discomfort arose quietly rather than naming it, because naming it was what fragile women did, and I was trying very hard not to be fragile. By year 7, I had made myself so small in those rooms that I had nearly disappeared. And then I was standing in a pediatrician's waiting room, holding my daughter's hand, and her grandmother's text was on my phone, and the blue fish was in the corner, and everything I had been breathing for 7 years was suddenly, irreversibly visible. I need to tell you about Davis before I go further, because the story is not honest without him, and the honest version of Davis is complicated in the way that the honest version of people we love is always complicated. Davis Whitfield was 37 when this story reaches its center. He was the younger of Patricia's 2 sons, the one she described as her sensitive one, which in the Whitfield family vocabulary meant the one whose feelings she considered herself qualified to interpret on his behalf. He was a structural engineer, quiet and precise, in the way of people who spend their professional lives accounting for the invisible forces acting on visible things. He was a good father, in the ways that were visible and present. He showed up to the school things, and the bedtimes and the weekend mornings. He was not absent. He was, however, a man who had grown up inside his mother's narrative for 37 years, and who had never been required to examine it, because the narrative was comfortable, and because examining it would have required him to see something about his mother that he was not yet ready to see. Patricia had a way with Davis that I had noticed from the first dinner, and that I had not known how to name for a very long time. She spoke to him as both child and confessor simultaneously. She told him things that a mother should not tell a son, about her own marriage, about her dissatisfactions, about the specific ways in which she had sacrificed. And Davis, who loved her, and who had been the repository of these confidences since he was old enough to be trusted with them, had learned to orient himself in relation to his mother's comfort in a way that was so habitual it had become invisible to him. When Patricia was uncomfortable, Davis smoothed things. When Patricia expressed concern, Davis investigated. When Patricia suggested, Davis considered, not because he was a weak man. Because the groove had been worn so deep over 37 years that he moved in it without feeling the sides. He had not read the text before it went to my phone. That, I believed, what I needed to understand over the following weeks was what he did when he found out I had read it. I want to tell you about my friend Marguerite Broussard before I tell you about the confrontation, because Marguerite is the reason I did not handle the confrontation the way I would have handled it in year 2 of my marriage, which would have been badly. Marguerite was my closest friend, a speech therapist I had met in our graduate program in New Orleans 11 years earlier. She was the kind of woman who combined extraordinary warmth with an absolute intolerance for self-deception, which made her both the most comforting and the most clarifying person I knew. She had been watching the Whitfield situation from the outside for 7 years, with the patient attention of someone who has understood the full picture for a long time and has been waiting for the person inside the picture to be ready. I called her from my car in the pediatrician's parking lot after the appointment. My daughter was in her car seat in the back, eating a graham cracker and singing something quietly to herself. The afternoon was the specific heavy warmth of October in Louisiana, the warmth that should have left by October and hasn't yet. I read her the text. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Rosalie, how long have you had a stomach ache on Sunday nights?" I thought about it. I said, 7 years. She said, "And how long have you been calling that anxiety?" I sat in the hot car with my daughter singing in the back seat. I said, 7 years. She said, "It was not anxiety." I pressed my hand flat on the steering wheel. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to understand exactly what has been happening, all of it. Before I say a single word to Davis or to Patricia, I want to understand the full shape of it." She said, "Then that's what we do first. You build the picture completely before you open your mouth." I said, "How long will that take?" She said, "As long as it takes, but not longer." She was right about both things. I spent 3 weeks building the picture, not dramatically, not by confronting anyone or recruiting allies or making accusations, by doing what I had been trained to do professionally, which was to observe carefully and document precisely and resist the temptation to draw conclusions before the evidence was complete. I am a pediatric occupational therapist. My entire professional practice is built on the discipline of understanding what is actually happening for a child before deciding what to do about it. Not what appears to be happening, not what the referring physician has suggested is happening. What is actually happening, in the specific and observable and repeatable sense. I applied that discipline to my own life for 3 weeks. I kept a notebook, not hidden, just a notebook, the kind I used for case notes, small and black with a cloth cover. I wrote in it at the kitchen table in the evenings after my daughter was in bed. Davis saw it and asked once what I was working on. I said a case that was complicated. He nodded and went back to his book. That was true in a way he did not understand. In the notebook, I wrote down every memory of the previous 7 years that arrived when I sat quietly and let the picture assemble itself. The dinner in year 1, where Patricia had said, in front of Davis's brother and his wife and the brother's in-laws, that she worried about Davis marrying someone from such a different background, and had then immediately said she meant it as a compliment, that different backgrounds were enriching, the specific way the table had accepted this, and moved on while I had sat with it, for the remainder of the evening, and then for approximately 4 years. The phone call in year 2, which I had overheard the end of, where Patricia had told Davis that Rosalie seemed overwhelmed, and perhaps they should reconsider the timeline for having children, since Rosalie clearly had some things to work through. I had been 29 years old and entirely unoverwhelmed, and had at that point never mentioned children in any context that Patricia could have legitimately accessed. The comment in year 3 about how my housekeeping was admirable for someone with such a demanding job, which contained within it the suggestion that the housekeeping was insufficient, and the job was the excuse, and the admirable was doing the work of a compliment while carrying the weight of a criticism. The Christmas in year 4, where Patricia had given Davis a card, separate from the family card. A private card that she placed directly in his hand, with a look that excluded me from its contents as completely as if she had closed a door, and which Davis had read and thanked her for without showing me, and which I had not asked about, because asking would have been needy. The birthday in year 5, where Patricia had organized a surprise party for Davis at her house, and had invited everyone in his life except 2 people. The first was my sister, who had driven from Houston the previous 2 birthdays, and who was not told. The second was my best friend from childhood, Stephanie, who lived in Baton Rouge, and who had been at our wedding, and who received no invitation, and for whom no explanation was offered. I had said nothing about the birthday party to Davis. I had stood in his mother's living room and smiled and eaten the cake she had made, and thanked her for a lovely evening. And in year 6, the year before the text, when my daughter had started showing signs of speech delay, and I had spent 3 months observing and assessing, and eventually recommending a course of speech therapy. 3 months of the specific private terror of a professional who is encountering in her own child the kind of thing she treats in other people's children. Patricia had told Davis, in a conversation I had not been present for, but that Davis had reported to me later, in the way he reported his mother's opinions, that she thought perhaps Rosalie was being oversensitive, and that children developed at different rates, and that sometimes we see what we're trained to look for. My daughter had a speech delay. The speech therapy had worked. She was 4 years old and talking constantly and beautifully, and had been for 18 months. Patricia had been wrong. Patricia had been wrong about many things, but she had said them with such consistent authority, in such a consistent register of concern, that the wrongness had been invisible, because it had always been dressed as love. I filled 17 pages of the black notebook. On the 18th page, I wrote 1 sentence. I wrote, "She has been doing this the whole time." Then I wrote, underneath it, "And Davis has been letting her." I sat with those 2 sentences for a long time. The second one was the harder one. I called my mother on a Thursday evening. This requires context, because calling my mother for this kind of conversation was not a thing I had done before in my adult life. My mother and I did not have that kind of relationship. We had the other kind, the kind built from showing up rather than from talking about showing up. She came to things. I came to things. We cooked together on holidays. We did not discuss our interior lives in any depth, because that was not the language we had been given, and neither of us had ever needed to learn a different one. But I called her because she was 67 years old, and she had been watching the Whitfield situation from a respectful distance for 7 years, and I suddenly needed to know what she had seen from that distance. She answered on the second ring. In the background, I could hear the salon, the specific acoustic of a nail salon in the evening, the fans and the low music and the faint chemical smell that I associated with every afternoon of my childhood. I said, "Mama, I need to ask you something." She said, "What happened?" I said, "Nothing yet. I need to ask you what you have thought about the Whitfields. Honestly, what you have thought for 7 years that you have not said." There was a pause. My mother does not pause often. She is a decisive woman who says what she thinks in the fewest possible words and moves on. The pause told me she had been waiting for this question. She said, "I think Davis's mother does not want him to have a full life." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means she wants the piece of him that is hers to stay hers. A woman who has a full life does not threaten that peace. A woman she can keep small does not threaten it either. I said, "She thinks I'm fragile, Mama." She said, "She made you fragile. That is different." I looked out my kitchen window. The October garden was going to its autumn state, the specific dying down of things that will come back in spring. But look, in October, like they might not. I said, "Did you see it happening?" She said, "I saw it from the first dinner. I did not say anything because you did not ask, and because I thought you would find it yourself." I said, "I should have asked sooner." She said, "You asked when you were ready. That is the right time." She said, "Rosalie." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your father and I came here with $200. Nobody in this country wanted us here. We built anyway. We showed up anyway. We raised you to show up." I said, "I know, Mama." She said, "You have been shrinking yourself for 7 years in a house where they do not deserve the size of you. Stop shrinking." I looked at the October garden. I said, "I know." She said, "Good. Now tell me what you are going to do." I told Davis about the text on a Friday evening. Not immediately. Not the day it arrived. I waited 3 weeks until the notebook was full and the picture was complete. And I had sat with Marguerite on 2 separate evenings. And I had called my mother. And I had spent a long time understanding exactly what I was going to say before I said it. My daughter was at my parents' house for the night. I had asked them to take her for a sleepover, which they had accepted without question, in the specific way of people who understand that when their child asks for a clear evening, it is because a clear evening is required. I made dinner, not as a performance or a softening. Because making dinner while thinking is something I do, and because I had a pot of my father's faux recipe on the stove that had been simmering for 4 hours, and that filled the kitchen with the specific smell of my childhood that I wanted in the room for this conversation. I set the bowls on the table. I set the notebook on the table beside my bowl. Davis sat down. He looked at the notebook. He looked at me. He said, "What's going on?" I said, 3 weeks ago, in the pediatrician's waiting room, I received a text message on my phone. It was from your mother. It was meant for you. I told him what it said. He was still. I said, "I want you to know that I am not angry about the text itself. I am using the text as the beginning of a conversation I should have been capable of having for the past 7 years, and have not been capable of having, because something has been making me smaller in this marriage, and I need to tell you what that something is." He said, "Rosalie," I said, "please let me finish." He was quiet. I opened the notebook. I did not read all 17 pages to him. I read the specific entries, 8 of them. The dinner in year 1, the phone call in year 2, the Christmas card in year 4, the birthday party in year 5, the speech therapy conversation in year 6. I read them without editorial, without my emotional response to them. Just what had happened, when and who had been present. When I finished, the PO was cooling. Davis was looking at the table. I said, "I am not asking you to choose between your mother and your wife. I am asking you to see what has been happening, because I have been living inside it for 7 years, and I have been making myself smaller to accommodate it, and I cannot continue to do that." He said, "She worries about me." I said, "She has been using her worry about you as a mechanism for managing me. Those are not the same thing." He looked up. He said, "That's not fair to her." I said, "Davis. The text said I was crying and needy. I have been at a sick child's bedside for 48 hours. That is not neediness. That is motherhood. He was quiet. I said, I have a notebook with 17 pages of incidents like this going back 7 years. I am not misremembering. I am not being oversensitive. I have been documenting. These are specific, dated, observable events that form a pattern. That is my professional training applied to my own marriage, and the picture it makes is not ambiguous. He said nothing for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the October evening had gone dark. The garden was invisible. The Po was completely cold. He said, How long have you been writing in that notebook? I said, 3 weeks. He said, Why didn't you tell me before? I said, Because every time I tried to say something about your mother in the first 3 years, the conversation ended with me apologizing for being oversensitive. And at some point, I stopped trying because I had started to believe that I was. He looked at me, the look of a man who has just been handed a specific and unarguable accounting of something he has been not looking at for 7 years. He said, I didn't know she was sending texts like that. I said, I believe you. He said, I don't think she meant. I said, Davis, intent is not the measure here. Effect is. What your mother has done over 7 years, intentionally or not, is create a version of me in your family's understanding that is smaller and more difficult than I actually am. And you have accepted that version because it is easier than examining where it came from. He looked at the table for a very long time. Then he said the thing I had not been certain he was capable of saying. He said, You're right. 2 words. I had been waiting 7 years for 2 words, and they arrived at a kitchen table over cold pho on a Friday night in October, in the specific quiet way that true things arrive when they finally come. He said, What do you need from me? I said, I need you to have a conversation with your mother, not to punish her, not to damage your relationship with her, but to tell her clearly that what she has been doing to this marriage is not acceptable, and that it stops now. He said, She's going to cry. I said, Probably. He said, She's going to say, I'm taking your side. I said, There are no sides. There is what has been happening, and what needs to happen differently. You can frame it that way. He said, Will you be there? I said, Not for that conversation. That one is yours. He nodded. He said, I'm sorry, Rosalie. I should have seen it. I said, You should have, and you're seeing it now. That's what matters for what comes next. We sat at the table for a long time after that. Neither of us moved to reheat the feo. The garden outside was still invisible in the dark. Somewhere in the October neighborhood, a dog was barking at something, and then stopping, and then starting again with the specific intermittent anxiety of a creature that can sense something it cannot identify. I understood that feeling completely. Davis went to his mother's house on the following Tuesday. I did not ask for a report. I asked for one thing. I asked that when he came home, he tell me, simply and honestly, whether he had said what needed to be said, not the specifics, not a transcript, just whether he had said it. He came home at 9 that evening. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired in the way that people look tired after conversations that have required them to be more honest than they are accustomed to being. He said, I said it. I said, How did she take it? He said, She cried. I said, And? He said, She said she only ever wanted what was best for me. I said, And? He said, I told her that what was best for me was a marriage where my wife was not being systematically described as fragile to my entire family. I told her that I had not understood what was happening, and that was my failure, I told her that I was asking her to stop. I said, "Did she hear you?" He said, "I think she heard the version she could tolerate, but I think she heard enough." I nodded. He said, "She asked about coming to Sunday dinner." I said, "Not yet." He said, "That's what I told her." We stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet. My daughter was asleep down the hall, making the small, specific sounds of a child deep in a dream. He said, "Rosalie, I need you to know something." I said, "Okay." He said, "When I read that text after you told me about it, the one she sent, I called her before I came home that night. I told her it had gone to the wrong phone. I looked at him. He said, she said it was a mistake, that she was just worried about me." I said, "And what did you say?" He said, "I said that I knew about the other things, that you had a notebook with 7 years of them in it, that the text was not a mistake. It was a pattern, and I should have seen the pattern before you had to document it for me." He looked at me. He said, "I should have been paying better attention to what was happening to you in my family's house. I was not paying attention, and I am sorry." I looked at my husband, the good man and the not fully seeing man, and the 7 years, and the notebook on the table, and the cold pho, and the October garden, and everything it had taken to get to this kitchen on this Tuesday night. I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know. Let me tell you about the conversation with Patricia. It happened 6 weeks after Davis's visit to his mother, at my request, on neutral ground, which was a coffee shop on 3rd Street that neither of us had a particular association with, which mattered because I did not want either of our histories in the room. Patricia arrived before me. She was sitting at a corner table in the specific posture of a woman who is prepared for a conversation and is managing her preparation carefully. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan that I had seen her wear to church. She looked smaller than she did in her own house. Most people do. I ordered a coffee at the counter before I sat down. I did it deliberately. I needed something in my hands, and I needed 45 seconds of not looking at her while I settled into myself. I sat down. She said, "Rosalie, I want to start by saying that I love you." I said, "Patricia, I'd like to start differently." She looked slightly caught. I said, "I'm not here to discuss whether you love me. I'm here because I have spent 7 years inside a narrative about who I am that you have been constructing, and I want you to know that I know it exists, and I know its shape." She said, "I don't know what you mean." I said, "I think you do, and I think if you sit with the question honestly, you'll find the answer without me having to list the incidents, but I'll list them if that's what's required." She looked at her coffee. I said, "What I need to tell you is this. I am not fragile. I am not needy. I am not difficult. I am a woman who has been doing serious work in her profession and her marriage and her parenting for 7 years, and I have been doing it while being described to my husband's family in language that makes me smaller than I am." She said, "Rosalie, I never meant..." I said, "I know you believe that, and it doesn't change what the effect has been." She was quiet. I said, "I am not asking you to apologize today. I am not asking you to admit anything that you're not ready to admit. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm asking you for one specific thing." She looked up. I said, "I am asking you to stop." She said, "Stop what?" I said, "Stop interpreting me to your son. Stop describing my behavior to your family in terms that frame me as a problem. Stop sending texts about whether Davis deserves better. She flinched. That last one had landed. She said, I was worried about him. I said, Patricia. He has a wife who showed up at his daughter's bedside for 48 hours when she was sick. He does not need to be rescued from me. She looked at her coffee for a long time. Then she said something I had not expected. Not an apology. Not a defense. Something in between, in the specific register of a woman who is encountering a version of herself she has not previously been required to look at, and is doing so with the beginning of something that might eventually become honesty. She said, I have always been afraid of losing him. I said, I know. She said, when he met you, everything changed so fast. I said, that is what happens when people fall in love and build a life. Things change. She said, I didn't know how to fit. I said, you could have asked. I would have made room. She looked at me. I said, I would have, Patricia. I am not your enemy. I have never been your enemy. I wanted a mother-in-law. I came to every Sunday dinner for 7 years, and I sat at your table, and I ate your food, and I wanted to belong to your family. You made that very difficult. But it was not impossible. And if you are willing, it is still not impossible. She pressed her hand against the table. She said, I don't know if I know how to do this differently. I said, neither do I. But that is where you start. Not knowing how. Being willing anyway. She looked out the window at 3rd Street. A man was walking a dog that was walking him. The specific joyful chaos of a large dog on a narrow leash, and it made her smile briefly, before she caught herself, and went back to serious. I waited. She said, I would like to try. I said, good. Then we start there. We sat for another 20 minutes. We did not resolve anything. We did not hug. We did not make plans. We sat with 2 cups of coffee and the beginning of an honest conversation. And that is what a beginning looks like. It does not look like resolution. It looks like 2 people in a coffee shop on 3rd Street on a November morning, sitting in the specific discomfort of a thing that is not finished, but has finally started. Let me tell you where things are now. It has been 14 months since the pediatrician's waiting room, and the text, and the blue fish in the corner that my daughter wanted to show me. My daughter is 5 now. She talks constantly and beautifully, and has opinions about everything, including the color of her shoes, and whether certain clouds look like dogs, and what her fish at home is thinking at any given moment. She is extraordinary in the specific way that all children are extraordinary, and that I am only occasionally capable of seeing clearly, because seeing your own child clearly requires a distance you do not always have when you are also her mother. Davis and I are in couples counseling, not because the marriage is failing, because we decided, in the aftermath of everything, that we wanted to understand how something could have been happening for 7 years inside our marriage, that one of us was living and the other was not seeing. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mouton, who has the specific gift of asking questions that arrive like a light in a dark room, said something in our 3rd session that I have not stopped thinking about. She said, a marriage is not just 2 people. It is also the story each person's family of origin has been telling about relationships since before either of them was born. When those stories conflict, the conflict often lives in the marriage as a thing nobody can name. The thing nobody could name in our marriage had been named. The naming had been hard and necessary, and the marriage on the other side of it was different, in the way that a room is different when the furniture has been rearranged. The same room, different arrangement, lighter somehow, more honest. Patricia comes to Sunday dinner now. Not every Sunday, some Sundays. The dinners are different. Not perfect. Different. She looks at me differently, not with the concern she had always weaponized, with something that is closer to actual attention. She asks questions about my work sometimes. She asked once about a child I had mentioned on a previous visit, a child with a particular challenge I had been working through, and she had listened to my answer with the full attention of a person who is trying to understand something rather than waiting to redirect. She brought me a recipe last month, written on an index card in her handwriting. Her grandmother's bread pudding, she said. She thought I might like it. I thanked her. I made it the following Sunday. It was very good. I told her so. She looked pleased in the specific, uncomplicated way of someone who has done something genuinely rather than performatively and has received a genuinely response to it. That is not reconciliation. That is the first few steps on a road that may or may not lead there. I am not certain what it will become. I am willing to find out. My mother came for dinner 2 weeks ago. Her and my father both, which they do once a month now. A practice that began after I called my mother from the October parking lot, and that has quietly become one of the things in my life I look forward to most. My mother and Patricia have not met. That meeting, if it happens, is for another season. My parents arrive at 5:30. My father always brings something from the restaurant, something in a container that he sets on my kitchen counter with the same deliberate care he has always used for things that matter. My mother always picks up my daughter and holds her for approximately 2 minutes, in the silence of someone for whom holding is the complete sentence. My daughter calls her grandmother Ba Noi. She says it perfectly. She has said it perfectly since she was 3. The speech delay resolved 18 months ago. My daughter talks constantly. She told Ba Noi last visit that the cloud outside the window looked like a sleeping bear. And Ba Noi said yes, it did, and they looked at it together for a long time. That is showing up. That is the whole language. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I close. The notebook. I kept it for 3 weeks while I built the picture. Then, the picture was complete, and I showed it to Davis, and the conversation happened, and I did not need the notebook for evidence anymore. I did not throw it away. I have it in the drawer of my bedside table. Not because I am waiting to use it, because it is a record of something important. Not of Patricia's failures, of my own clarity, of the 3 weeks when I looked honestly at my own life and let myself see what was actually there without protecting myself from it. My professional training says that the most important thing in working with a child who is struggling is not identifying what is wrong. It is helping the child understand what they are actually capable of, what they have been capable of all along, but have not yet been given the conditions to show. The notebook is the record of a woman who finally gave herself the conditions to show what she had been capable of all along. I had not been fragile for 1 day of my life. I had been made to feel fragile in a house that needed me small to keep its story intact. The house and I have a different story now, and I am the right size in it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, exactly as large as it needed to be. My grandmother in Vietnam, whom I never met, made a specific kind of embroidery that my mother learned from a photograph and described to me once as a child. Very small stitches, very precise, building a picture that from a distance looked like one thing, and up close looked like 10,000 individual decisions that had been made correctly. I think about that embroidery often. I think about the 10,000 individual decisions that build a life, the ones that look from a distance, like a marriage or a family or a career, and that up close are each a specific choice, made in a specific moment with specific hands. I think about the decision to write in the notebook. I think about the decision to call my mother. I think about the decision to sit at the kitchen table and speak clearly, instead of managing myself into the shape the room required. Each one a small stitch. Each one a decision made correctly. From a distance, what they build is a life that is finally the right size. Up close, they are just a woman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, sitting in a pediatrician's waiting room, looking at a blue fish in a corner tank, holding her daughter's hand, reading a text that was not meant for her, and deciding, in the 37 seconds before the nurse calls her daughter's name, that she is done being small. That is where this story starts. That is where every story like this one starts. Not with a grand confrontation, or a dramatic moment, or a folder on a table. With a decision, in a waiting room, that you are done, and then the next decision, and then the one after that. 10,000 small stitches, and the picture they build is yours. You were not fragile. You were made to feel fragile in a house that needed you small to keep its story intact. The day you decide you are done being small is the day your actual life begins.